Now I'd like to introduce Karlijn Meeks, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Genomics and Global Health at the National Institutes of Health. And Dr. Meeks will be speaking on obesity in African subpopulations. Welcome.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to speak. I'll be presenting here data from the University of Amsterdam. I'll be talking to you about obesity in African migrant and non-migrant populations. So why this focus on migrants? Well, globally we are experiencing rapid ethnic diversification due to an increase in international migration. So according to the UN, there were about 173 million international migrants in 2000, and this had already increased to 258 million in 2017. So this is a 49% increase in just 17 years' time. High-income countries host about 2/3 of all migrants, and large European cities such as London and Amsterdam, 1 in 3 is of migrant descent. Of course, the US is also highly ethnically diverse. Here in Washington, D.C., 49% of the population is of African descent. So there's clearly a need to assess migrant health, and there's 3 main ways for doing this. The first way of assessing migrant health is to compare the migrant population with the host population. So, for example, comparing African migrants with living in Europe with the European host population. When you make this comparison, you're looking at ethnic differences or ethnic inequalities. And this is the most commonly used design to study migrant health. There's, however, 2 other important designs. The second is to compare one ethnic minority group, one migrant group, living in different countries. When you make this comparison, you're studying the role of national context. Does it matter for migrants which country you migrate to? Then the third design is to compare a migrant group with the compatriots who have not migrated. So comparing migrants with non-migrants. When you make this comparison, you're looking at the role of migration. So let me give you some examples. This is data from the Helios study, a large cohort study in Amsterdam, which used the first design to compare 5 ethnic minority groups with the Dutch host population in Amsterdam. So these are the rates of overweight and obesity in the 5 ethnic minority groups compared to the Dutch. So in yellow is overweight and in red is obesity. And what you see is that all ethnic minority groups are more affected by overweight and obesity compared to the Dutch host population on the left. And we observe the highest rates of overweight and obesity in the African descent populations, in the Ghanaians and in the Surinamese of African descent. However, so there's a large difference between high-income countries, as we also seen from the previous speakers, with regards to overweight and obesity prevalence. So, here, US is here on the right, with very high overweight and obesity prevalence of about 70%, while the Netherlands, where I just showed you the data from, is much more on the left, with an overweight and obesity prevalence of just under 50%, and even our neighboring country, Germany, is much higher. So this shows the large differences between the European countries. And for migrants, it matters which country they migrate to. Because these countries differ in national context, and these contextual differences can influence, for example, opportunities in life, such as socioeconomic status, lifestyle and related factors, for example, through the food environment and thereby diet. Also healthcare, for example, access to healthcare and healthcare policies differ between countries. It's important to look at this role of national context. And if you do that with the design comparing one migrant group across countries, you can therefore pinpoint which contextual factors are driving increased risk for overweight and obesity. And this knowledge is beneficial for the migrant populations in those countries, but also for the host population, if you can find out which contextual factors are important for increased risk. So this is an example to show the role of national context on health behavior. So this is data from the Netherlands and from England showing the prevalence of tobacco smoking. What you see is in the host populations, you see that there's a higher prevalence of smoking in the Netherlands among the Dutch compared to the English in England. And this same pattern is reflected in the migrant populations living in these countries. So we see a higher prevalence of smoking among African migrants living in the Netherlands compared to African migrants living in England. And again, the same pattern for Indians, higher smoking prevalence among Indians living in the Netherlands compared to Indians living in England. So this clearly shows the role of national context on health behavior and also related health outcomes. Then the third design to assess migrant health is to study the role of migration. And this is important both for the migrant populations as well as for the non-migrants. For the ethnic minority populations, by comparing them to their compatriots who have not migrated, you can reveal real lifestyle changes, which factors differ between migrants and non-migrants, and could therefore explain increased risk of overweight and obesity among migrants. To pinpoint these factors increasing overweight and obesity risk. And what we've seen is that these results are taken much more seriously by the migrant population. If you compare them with the European host population, they sometimes feel that's an unfair comparison. Well, if you compare them with their compatriots living still in the country of origin, then they take this message much more seriously. Results from this type of study are also very important for the non-migrants still living in the countries of origin, because the rapid changes in lifestyle and urbanization that migrants have experienced likely reflect on what's happening currently in low and middle income countries. So it provides an indication for future threat of overweight and obesity and other diseases. So this is some example data from the role of migration. This is data from about 10 years ago, where we saw a very steep increase in overweight and obesity prevalence from rural Ghana to urban Ghana to the Netherlands. In this graph, the yellow bars are those younger than 40 years, and the red bars those aged over 40 years, and men and women. And both the men and women saw this very steep increase from rural to urban to the Netherlands, with particularly very high rates of overweight and obesity among Ghanaians living in the Netherlands, up to 95% among Ghanaian women aged over 40 years old living in Amsterdam. Then I would like to present you some insights from the RODAM study, which is a recent study combining the latter two designs for assessing migrant health. This study was initiated by Charles Ajemang, who is the PI of the study. The RODAM study is acronym for Research on Obesity and Diabetes Among African Migrants. For RODAM, we collected data in Ghana, in rural and in urban Ghana, and also among Ghanaian migrants living in London, Berlin, and Amsterdam. So by including these 5 sites, we could study the role of migration by comparing the Ghanaian migrants in Europe with those who have not migrated. By comparing the 3 European countries, we can look at the role of national context. The goal was to include a random sample of 1,250 Ghanaians per location, and in total we sampled over 6,300 participants for all 5 locations combined. Then, these are some pictures of the data collection. This was in rural Ghana. This is the local research team who went out into the field with a jeep to collect samples and measure participants. This is in urban Ghana, where we collected data also in hospital settings. And these are some pictures from the data collection in Europe, in Berlin, London, and Amsterdam. So to show you the results, this is the prevalence of overweight and obesity, so BMI higher or equal than 25, across the 5 locations. So these all Ghanaians, one ethnic group living in the different locations. And what you see is that there's some role of national context with about 10 percentage points higher prevalence of overweight and obesity in London compared to Berlin, both for men and women. But there's a much larger role of migration, with lower prevalences in rural Ghana and higher in urban Ghana and highest in Europe. However, if I compare that with the data from 10 years ago that I showed you previously, the increase is no longer as steep as we saw 10 years ago, with already also very high prevalences of overweight and obesity also in urban Ghana, about 70%. This is the data for obesity alone, BMI higher than 30, and what you see is that in particular, women are severely affected by overweight and obesity, with prevalences up to 54% among Ghanaians in London. And again, a much larger role of migration than of national context, although again, those living in the UK are more affected than those living in Berlin. Previously, it was illustrated to look at different obesity measures. So this is data for abdominal obesity based on waist circumference. And again, we see a very high burden among women, up to 76% in London, and much lower rates of abdominal obesity in men. And this is contradicting to the data that we see for obesity. While we see a much higher burden of overweight and obesity among women compared to men, the burden of diabetes is actually higher in men than in women. Some role of national context, we see higher rates of diabetes in Berlin and lower in London, so quite the opposite of the overweight and obesity rates. And what stands out as well is that the diabetes prevalence is already at a similar high rate in urban Ghana compared to the European countries. And although rural Ghana has still lower prevalences of 5.5% and 3.5% is already really high given a rural context. So as Dr. Malik also explained, is that there are different ethnic differences in the relationship between obesity and health outcomes, such as diabetes. So what we see here is that on the y-axis, the probability for diabetes, and on the x-axis, the BMI. And what you see is, as expected, that for a higher BMI, the probability for diabetes increases. However, what we see as well is these different colored lines are the different sites. So the bottom line is rural Ghana, the top line is Berlin. So for the same BMI, the probability of diabetes is higher in Berlin compared to rural Ghana. And we see the same for waist circumference. For the same waist circumference, there's a higher probability of diabetes in Berlin compared to rural Ghana. These are the data for men, but we see a similar pattern in women. So this clearly illustrates the role of national context beyond just BMI. So I'd like to briefly touch upon the underlying factors of overweight and obesity in this population. There's three main components: a genetic component, an environmental component, and an epigenetic component. So for the environmental component, I'm going to be very brief. It's just basically all environmental factors different between the national context and that differ between migrants and non-migrants. So this includes food environment and thereby diet, also physical activity, stress, discrimination, and many factors that all can increase the risk of overweight and obesity in migrants compared to non-migrants. Then for the genetic component, in general, over 80 loci have been associated with common obesity. However, the explained fraction of heritability is small, and more importantly, data on African populations are very limited. So this figure shows the proportion of GWAS, of genetic studies the majority is in European ancestry populations, and only a small minority of genetic studies are performed in non-European populations, of which, again, the largest part among Asians. So the genetic data in African populations are very, very limited. And then there's an epigenetic component. So epigenetics are cellular mechanisms that regulate gene expression. And you could see this as being in between the genetic and the environmental components. Well, genetics, your DNA is robust and cannot change over time within one individual. Epigenetics can change, and it can be affected by lifestyle factors. For example, if you start smoking or change your diet or change your physical activity, then this can induce epigenetic changes, and epigenetic changes can in turn increase health risks. Epigenetics has been associated with a wide range of health outcomes, also with obesity. So we studied the association between epigenetics and obesity in Rodham and African populations. There had not been an epigenetic study before in Africans, and we found novel loci associated with obesity in our cohort in Ghanaians. So, however, much more work is needed to look at which are the environmental factors driving these epigenetic changes and thereby increasing overweight and obesity risk, or is overweight and obesity inducing these epigenetic changes and thereby increasing risk for other diseases. So this is the first step, and more work is needed. So then, to summarize, so we see a very high burden of overweight and obesity among African migrants in Europe, and also increasing rates in the African region. In particular, in women, the trend that we observed 10 years ago, with lower rates in rural Ghana, higher in urban and highest in Europe, is already fading, with urban Ghana being almost at a similar level as Europe. We also see that obesity is an independent risk factor for diabetes in this population, but context matters. Rural Ghanaians seem to be more protected from developing diabetes for a similar BMI. And lastly, there's clearly a need to unravel the underlying factors of overweight and obesity in this population, and thereby we need to look at genetic factors, environmental, and also epigenetic determinants. These are the partners involved in Rodham at the different sites. And then, thank you.